Everyone says they want disclosure. They want to know the truth about the beings, the craft, they want to see the files, they want an official admission that we're not alone. But what if the deepest, most closely held secret about disclosure is about so much more than that? What if the real taboo is about what's hidden in us? In this one, we're going straight into one of the darkest possibilities in all of UFO lore. The idea that some of the oldest stories on the planet may not be primitive fantasies or myths, but memories of real events. Memories of how we were created and used, how we rose up against our makers and then were wiped out as punishment. At the heart of these stories are mysterious beings, gods, Nephilim, Gilgamesh, but who were they really? And this isn't just an ancient story. The now missing General Neil McCasland, who once ran highly classified, mysterious programs out of the famed Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, was also deeply interested in these very stories. But why? What did he know? Why did he tell the authors of Secret Machines, which we'll be exploring today, to look at the story of Prometheus if they want to know the truth about the UFO phenomenon? What seems to be the answer, if true, is pretty terrifying. And before we get started, in case you didn't know, this is actually part 2 of my reading of chapter 2 of Secret Machines Gods by Peter Levenda and Tom DeLonge. If you didn't catch part 1, I honestly think this part stands on its own. You're gonna be fine, but of course I do recommend digesting both for the full picture and context, and honestly the whole book for that matter. I've really become a huge fan of the work of Peter Levenda in particular. I also did do an episode with the great Peter Levenda. Links to that, part 1 and the book, will be in the description. All right, my friends, I cannot wait to finish up this chapter and finally share this with you guys. It's long overdue. I apologize. Life has been crazy. The channel has been crazy. But anyway, we're going to get right into it because we've got a girthy pile of words to get through, I'm pretty sure. All right, 1 million years a slave. About 2 million years ago, we saw the evolution of the first humans from their primate ancestors. This was Homo habilis, or handyman. Possibly the first tool-making primate ancestor, and is the subject of some controversy since not everyone agrees that this species is a hominid. Then about 1 million years ago, Homo erectus, upright man, made its appearance. Its origins are equally controversial, with some paleontologists suggesting that Homo erectus arose first in Africa and then spread to parts of Europe, Central Asia, China, and Indonesia, with other experts suggesting that Asia was the point of origin. It has even been proposed that some of the earlier extinct hominid species, such as Homo habilis, should properly be classified under the Homo erectus category. Eventually, however, Homo neanderthalensis made its appearance. Earliest forms seem to date to about 500,000 years ago, with the fully formed Neanderthals only about 250,000 years ago, and then became extinct about 40,000 years ago. Homo sapiens, of which we humans are a subspecies, known as Homo sapiens sapiens, arose around 200,000 years ago and coexisted for a time with Neanderthals until the latter became extinct. Side note, I'm pretty sure this date keeps getting pulled back. It's unbelievable how mysterious and truly ancient our origin seems to be. I think the latest figure I saw is something like 300,000 years now. But I'm always confronted by this fact, right? That we know so little, and we have so little evidence about what was going on in our deep past, how advanced we were, let alone our origins. But anyway, continuing. So supposedly we arose around 200,000 years ago and coexisted for a time with Neanderthals until the latter became extinct. We share almost identical genetic heritage with Neanderthals, with only about 0.12% difference between us. According to genetic and paleontological evidence, therefore, the origins of humanity are broadly, if somewhat incompletely known. We can trace our lineage back 2 million years at the most liberal guess, to 1 million years, the conservative estimate, in time. At the very least, we can use the 200,000 to 250,000 year estimate of the appearance of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as our point of origin. It really depends on what one means by the term, quote, human, and especially, quote, modern human. There are questions of genetics, of course. There are also questions of consciousness. Did a larger brain size indicate greater intelligence? And did greater intelligence contribute to the development of consciousness? These are still controversial issues today, especially as it has become obvious that not everyone agrees on the definition of terms like intelligence and consciousness. If we do not know how to define consciousness, then we are unable to determine when it first developed. We are not even confident enough to state unequivocally that animals have consciousness. We are certainly nowhere near accepting that plants have consciousness, much less the elements themselves that make up human beings, animals and plants. As we will see in a later chapter, the genetic origins of consciousness are now being hotly debated. Without going into that controversy in detail, we can ask a few basic questions here, since they go to the problem of the origin of the human beings. And this problem relates directly to the question of the phenomenon itself. I'm already so excited. It's been a while since I read this, and I'm just remembering as I'm reading this. I love that he gets to the very base of this question, right? The nature of consciousness, because as you all know if you watch the channel, I find that question, that subject, to be so key to not only the phenomenon, but like everything anomalous and everything interesting about the human experience, really. First of all, let us assume that the nature of humanity and human beings presupposes the existence of consciousness. We feel we are different from every other creature on Earth because of our consciousness. We are introspective beings who wonder about things like life, death, the afterlife, etc., and we do not perceive the same concerns taking place among other members of the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. We also seek to control the environment in ways that no other species, genus, family, etc. has done. We build cities, cars, rocket ships. We design intelligent networks, create fiber optic cables and irrigation systems. We do not see other species doing the same. Ergo, we believe it is our consciousness that sets us apart from the rest of creation. We calculate, measure, manufacture, we create works of art, music, and literature. We do not see the same activity elsewhere among other creatures. Yet everything that lives has genetic material. There is now a growing body of evidence to suggest that the genetic code originated somewhere else than our planet, and that it is somehow, quote, seeded, unquote, onto the Earth, either accidentally due to a meteor strike or some other natural mechanism, or deliberately. This begs the question, is life the same as consciousness? Again, we do not agree on the definition of either of these terms, so it becomes an exercise in pure speculation to come down on one side or the other of this discussion. Instead, let us look for an answer, or at least trace evidence in the historical record. The Enuma Elish tells us that humans were created from the blood of the slain Kingu. And now remember, the Enuma Elish, if you've forgotten since part 1 or you haven't checked out part 1, the Enuma Elish is essentially the Babylonian, Mesopotamian god mythological cycle. It portrays the battle of these gods and the eventual slaying of Tiamat by Marduk. Fascinating stuff, particularly when you take it more seriously, not just as a complete work of fiction, but maybe an ancient attempt to explain something that happened among higher beings that are responsible for our very seeding or creation. So yeah, we're essentially talking a bit more like esoteric ancient alien stuff here. Okay, the Enuma Elish tells us that humans were created from the blood of the slain Kingu. Remember that Kingu was appointed by Tiamat to be the commander of the forces fighting Marduk, and he was also the god whom Tiamat gave the Tablet of Destinies. Thus, Kingu represents the enemy of Marduk, and it is from Kingu's blood that humanity is formed. Humanity therefore traces its origins to a weak, illegitimate, and defeated spiritual force. The purpose behind our creation was to work as slaves for the gods, who are therefore relieved of any hard labor, and who are thus assured of a continuous supply of food and drink. This is exactly as it was stated in the ancient Sumerian and Babylonian texts. the elaborate theories of Zecharia Sitchin and others that humans were developed to engage in mining operations, etc., are simply not necessary in order to make the point that the Sumerians believed that the humans were created to work for the gods. It is an unnecessary complication for which there is a tenuous at best evidence. So again, love this from Levenda here. The nuance that we don't need to go, if you're not familiar with the work of Zecharia Sitchin, it's essentially what he just said. Sitchin was this very controversial scholar who stated that not only were we created by the Anunnaki, by these gods, but we were literally used as slave labor to mine gold for them. But even if you take that mythological structure or that story structure to a less extreme degree and you just read it more directly, it still says that human beings were essentially made in the image of a weaker, defeated spiritual force and used as like slave labor or as servants for these beings. So it's pretty wild either way. The cosmos itself was created from the body of Tiamat. Her bones, blood, and organs were used in various ways to complete the organization of the external world. The blood of her consort Kingu was used to create humans, thus humans are not the same genetic line as the rest of the universe. Although their origin is due to divine energy, the will of Marduk, and divine substance, the blood of Kingu, it should be noted that the god who actually does the work of creating the humans, once told to do so by Marduk, is the Sumerian god Enki. Enki was the lord of fresh water, of artifice, magic, and the ability to manipulate matter. His temple was known as the Absu, with its clear reference to the Absu or the abyss. In other versions of the creation story, Enki takes a more central role in the creation of human beings, but always winds up using the blood of another god, in one case clay mixed with blood, and always for the purpose of using human beings as slave labor. Eventually, however, the slaves revolt. When that happens, the gods decide to wipe them off the face of the earth with the Great Flood. Deluge stories and legends are known virtually worldwide, and that may be due to the memory of a single flood that took place in the distant past, or more likely refers to various floods occurring in different parts of the world at different times. Many people living today have had experiences of floods. They are relatively a common occurrence, and there is no need to look for a single cataclysmic event that affected the entire globe. What is a common denominator between the Babylonian account and that in Genesis, however, is that both floods are the result of the gods or God becoming angry with human beings. In other words, humans brought the flood upon themselves. Another common denominator is the idea of a special human who is spared along with his family. This story may be taken in two different ways. In the first place, we may be seeing an ancient attempt to describe natural selection. This is the essential theme of Darwinism, which states that some species die out and others survive due to their inability or ability, respectively, to adapt to environmental forces. When some humans survive a catastrophe, a cataclysmic event like a tsunami or other natural disaster, we may describe them and their offspring as having been the product of natural selection. However, this is not exactly true. In Darwinian terms, this process takes place over long periods of time and is not the result of a single event taking place over weeks or even months, but rather adaptations and mutations of the species that survive under hostile conditions or develop as strategies appropriate to their particular environment. It may be that what the authors of Genesis were describing was a memory of other hominids becoming extinct, leaving only Homo sapiens sapiens alive to tell the tale. That's definitely an interesting take, and that would definitely fly in the face of conventional history, I think, because we're talking about, I think the flood most of us are familiar with is and reaching into my Randall Carlson grab bag here, is the sort of Meltwater Pulse 1b cataclysmic event that would have taken place, I think it's 11,600 years ago or so. So this would have to be some kind of event that happened deeper in our ancient past to wipe out, I think, the other human subspecies. Probably doesn't really matter. I think Levenda is sort of just throwing out a hypothetical here. Continuing. The other way of interpreting those stories is to suggest that the selection was not natural at all, but deliberate. In fact, in Genesis, God specifically tells Noah to build the ark. Once again, authority comes from a divine source. The power to build the ark, however, is human. Humans, after all, are still slave labor, even as late as Genesis 6. Before that happens, however, there's a bit of stage setting. One of the prominent theories of Sitchin and others, both before and after him, concerns an enigmatic reference to Genesis 6, which is the chapter of the Bible dealing with Noah and the flood. It opens with a reference to the, quote, sons of God and daughters of men, unquote. And then on to the Nephilim. This is one of those areas that has been exploited by Sitchin, von Daniken, and others who have promoted the, quote, ancient alien theory because it is one of the strangest episodes in the Bible. It is actually one of the places in the Bible that could be used to support an ancient alien theory if it hadn't been misinterpreted by Sitchin and others who went overboard in their zeal to prove their own ideas. Sitchin about gold mining operations, the Anunnaki, and the 12th planet, and von Daniken with his insistence that the, quote, sons of God, unquote, were aliens engaged in artificial insemination of human beings. If we separate these fanciful notions from the texts themselves, we can see that there are grounds for supposing that this small section of the Bible, barely a paragraph, gives us the best indication yet that something truly weird took place in dim prehistory, and that the memory of it was fresh enough or traumatic enough that civilizations around the world retained some elements of it in their creation epics. And now onto a section I know will perk up the wonder whiskers of many of you. There were giants in those days. The New International Version of the King James Bible begins Genesis 6 this way. When men began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God that saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, quote, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years, unquote. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. There are a great many mysteries tied up in these few lines. Who were the, quote, sons of God, unquote? Who were the Nephilim? What is the meaning behind all the non-sequiturs in these two paragraphs? Why does God interject his statement about his spirit not contending with man forever between the two descriptions of the sons of God and the daughters of men? And if the children of their union gave rise to, quote, heroes of old, men of renown, unquote, if we are supposed to read the sequence that way, then why does the author of Genesis complain that men are wicked in the paragraph that follows? Quoting the Bible again, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, quote, I will wipe mankind who I have created from the face of the earth, unquote. Obviously, we're missing something. The sons of God, quote unquote, were supposed by many commentators to mean angels or some type of supernatural being. Later research indicates that the term, quote, son of God, unquote, was used to refer not to angels but to a kind of royalty, to kings or to high-ranking ministers. That indicates a social disconnect between men and, quote, sons of God, unquote. The opening sentence says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and thus the sons of God were not men in any kind of normal sense, but they had bodies that functioned as those of humans. The Hebrew term in Genesis 6 is Bene Elohim. It is a term that has been used in different ways to mean slightly different things. David Penchansky, a professor of theology, writes that Bene Elohim refers to divine council, a group of beings who serve as ministers to God. They either have human bodies or can assume human bodies in order to function on the earth. When they do assume human bodies, it seems that they are able to propagate through sexual intercourse with human women. The Bene Elohim are exclusively male, as the account in Genesis 6 suggests, and produce offspring from this union. In common UFO parlance, these might be considered hybrids. And now things get interesting, my friends. And this is one of the things I love about Levenda and his work in general, is it takes a while to get to these points. It's not always the juicy, sexy stuff. He really takes his time building the case, going through the material before making a statement like this, and I love that he maintains this sort of scholarly, thoughtful, logical process when he's going through this information. Anyway, continuing again before I verbally fondle my wonder nuggets too much. Enter the Nephilim. Sitchin wants to translate the word as fallen, i.e. fallen angels, after the Hebrew word nephal. That was a popular interpretation among biblical scholars for a while, but it since has been demonstrated to be faulty and not consistent with the rules of Hebrew grammar. It was actually a loan word from Aramaic, naphthala, and had been Hebraicized and given its plural form Nephilim. For some reason, the translators of the King James Bible kept the word Nephilim in their version without translating it themselves. There was a confusion or perhaps astonishment over the real meaning of Nephilim, which is probably what kept it in transliterated form. Nephilim, according to scholars of Hebrew and Aramaic, can only mean one thing: giants. This was not a word used in a general sense. Metaphorically referring to someone of great personal stature or charm, the word refers specifically to beings of extraordinary size. Genesis tells us the Nephilim were around in those days and afterward, the implication being after the flood. The further implication is that they are no longer around, for they were only around, quote, in those days, and also afterward, unquote, but evidently not now. It may be the Nephilim who are described as, quote, men of renown, unquote. There is also the repetition of the phrase, quote, on the earth, unquote. It appears 4 times in those 6 verses. Not to be coy, but where else would man be but, quote, on the earth, unquote? Were there men elsewhere in creation? Was it only those, quote, on earth, unquote, who had become troublesome in the eyes of their creator? Otherwise, why is the repetition, a form of emphasis, necessary? And where did the Nephilim, the giants, come from? One reading, the most commonly accepted, links the offspring of the sons of God with the daughters of men with the Nephilim. In other words, when the two mated, these monstrous forms were created. That would indicate that the sons of God were not part of the same gene pool as the men and the daughters of men. In other words, the kings of the earth, the Bene Elohim, the royalty, those holding the authority from God, were not human themselves. The human men were a slave race, as indicated above. Their daughters were part of that same race, obviously. The mating of the daughters with the Bene Elohim produced giants, genetic abnormalities. Briefly, we considered whether what was being described was some kind of Neanderthal. Were the Nephilim or their progenitors Neanderthals? Unfortunately, for many reasons, that can't be true. For one thing, Neanderthals were considerably shorter than Homo sapiens sapiens. They may have appeared more brutish, perhaps, but they were a good head or more shorter than their hominid siblings. Definitely not giants. Is there some clarification to be found in the earlier Babylonian sources? Fortunately, there is. And side note, I did always think that Neanderthals were larger, physically larger in size, but maybe that's a misnomer. Is there some clarification to be found in the earlier Babylonian sources? Fortunately, there is. Ooh, and here we go. I've been waiting for this character to make his appearance. One of the most famous personalities from Babylonian literature is Gilgamesh, the hero of the Gilgamesh epic and intimately associated with the Babylonian flood stories. In order to fully understand the idea of the Nephilim, then, we have to go back to earlier non-Jewish sources that had more finely articulated history of this period and that help clarify matters even as they present a startling alternative view. This includes the Gilgamesh material and those ideas associated with it, including the Apkallu or the Abgal. The Apkallu, to use the Babylonian term, Abgal to use the Sumerian, were 7 wise beings, 7 sages, who existed before and after the flood. They were responsible for teaching the newly created human beings the benefits of civilization. These were not humans, but divine or quasi-divine beings who could assume human form when necessary or desired. In other words, they were the template for the biblical idea of the Bene Elohim. The most controversial version of the story of the Apkallu comes from the Berosus, who was a priest of Bel-Marduk in the 3rd century BCE. According to his account, one of these Apkallu, named by him Oannes, would arise from the sea. presumably the Persian Gulf, each morning, and would teach the people what they needed to know about agriculture, astronomy, etc., and then would return to the sea at dusk. He would not eat or drink anything on land, and he dressed in an unusual suit that resembled a fish with scales. He wore a head covering which looked like the head of a fish, and his clothing resembled that of a fish, except for the fact that he walked on 2 feet. Eventually, the other Apkallu followed the first. They would remain in contact with human beings for some time, at least up to the flood. They were said to have their origins in the Absu, the abyss of Enki, and they were sent back there when they angered Marduk, who viewed them as having corrupted the human race. This, however, did not take place before the Apkallu began to mate with the human women and produce offspring that were part human and part Apkallu. These elements, taken from a variety of Sumerian and Babylonian sources, clearly anticipate Genesis 6. If biblical scholars such as Michael Heiser and David Penchansky are correct, then there is a strong Mesopotamian tradition of a council of normally invisible beings, the Apkallu, the Abgal, or the Bene Elohim, who appeared on the earth as advisors to the human race and who eventually mated with human women, creating monstrous offspring in the process. The biblical account is clearly a somewhat sanitized version of the Mesopotamian original, given a monotheistic spin. If we subtract the ideological changes from the story, we can see a very strong indication of a general belief that there was non-human contact with humans at some point in prehistory. This non-human contact is not merely a euphemism for God or angels, because the words that are used for these terms in the Bible, El Elohim, YHVH, Malachim, etc., are quite different from those used to characterize the Apkallu, Bene Elohim. These were beings of an order quite different from humans. Normally invisible, they would assume human form to interact with human beings, and even produce offspring from sexual intercourse with human women. Gilgamesh was one of these. According to what is generally known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, in reality a collection of cuneiform tablets containing narratives about the hero, Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He obtained knowledge of the world from before the flood by speaking with the Babylonian version of Noah and learning how he became immortal. Now largely believed to have been a historical figure, circa 2600 BCE, Gilgamesh had entered the realm of supernatural legend long before his presumed reign. He had rejected the advances of the goddess Inanna, for instance, and fought the demon Humwawa. In one of the tablets containing the Epic of Gilgamesh, found in the ancient city of Ugarit, Ras Shamra, we learn that Gilgamesh is a giant. He is described as being 11 cubits tall and 4 cubits wide. If each cubit is about 20 inches long, 11 cubits would mean that Gilgamesh was 220 inches, or about 18 feet tall, and 80 inches or 6 feet wide. His being a giant and 2/3 divine and 1/3 human would make him one of the Nephilim. The king of Uruk, Gilgamesh, was as much a culture hero as a godling. We may say of him that he was a, quote, man of renown, unquote. He certainly was a warrior, but his most famous exploits are those involving supernatural beings, such as the demon Humwawa, whose face is usually portrayed as a mass of entrails. In fact, the name Gilgamesh in cuneiform is often preceded by the dingir symbol, which is usually reserved as the identifier of a god. He is someone who straddles the line between Apkallu and human, a being who is conceived of a human woman, but whose paternity remained a mystery. In fact, according to the single legend concerning his birth, his mother, surrounded by armed guards to ensure she would not be molested and lose her virginity illegitimately, became pregnant with him even as she was under lock and key. Alarmed, the gods took the baby and threw him from the top of the tower to be dashed on the rocks below. But an eagle arrived just in time and settled the baby Gilgamesh safely onto the earth. Thus, without addressing it in so many words, the origin of Gilgamesh is that of a, quote, daughter of men, unquote, and a supernatural father, an Apkallu, and he developed into a giant who was 2/3 divine. This is in keeping with the biblical tradition as well as the Mesopotamian one. In fact, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Apkallu designed and built the walls of his city, Uruk. The Apkallu themselves are often defined as having human bodies but the heads of birds, similar to the type of iconography we find in Egyptian illustrations of Thoth, Horus, etc. Mesopotamian has reliefs that depict them as a type of griffin with 4 wings, as well as bird heads, indicating their capability of flight. In fact, it is probably these huge reliefs that were found in Babylon and elsewhere that give rise to the famous version of Ezekiel 1, a favorite of ancient alien theorists, in which the cherubim make their appearance as having 4 wings and 4 faces, those of a man, an eagle, an ox, and a lion. As Ezekiel had this vision in Babylon, it could be said that the local artwork influenced its content. A further connection of Gilgamesh to the flood story that starts with the discussion of, quote, sons of God, unquote, and the Nephilim is his visit to Uta-Napishtim, Sumerian Zi-Usudra, the Babylonian Noah. It was from this personality that Gilgamesh learned the ways of the world before the flood, for Uta-Napishtim survived the deluge in an ark with his family, plants, and small animals. Uta-Napishtim had saved the seed of humanity, and for this was rewarded by the gods with immortality. There's no space to go into this story in full, but it is mentioned to show that Genesis 6 has its origins in Babylonian religion, which itself had its origins in Sumer. This is an important summary here, if this is all kind of swimming around in your mind and you want to just condense it. The universe was created as a result of a struggle between invisible forces, characterized as fresh water and salt water, which gave birth to gods who turned on their parents and used the body of one to create reality and the blood of another to create humanity. Thus, humans are a product of one of the defeated gods. In some versions of the narrative, clay from the earth is used as a medium mixed with divine blood. The purpose of the creation of human beings was as slave labor for the gods. Also present in the heavens were intermediary forces, a kind of assembly or council known as the Apkallu in Babylon, the Abgal in Sumer, and the Bene Elohim among the Jews, who were in charge of the situation on earth. These beings were able to assume human form but were not human beings. They copulated with human women. There does not seem to have been a female Apkallu to mate with human men, and the result of their intercourse was a generation of Nephilim, or giants. For reasons which are not entirely clear, God or the gods decided to destroy the human race by sending a flood. However, they decided that some genetic material could be salvaged, and that resulted in the story of Noah in the Bible and Uta-Napishtim in Babylonia. At some point after the flood, the gods or their emissaries, the Apkallu, Abgal, Bene Elohim, disappeared. Suddenly, human beings were on their own again. The loss of contact with these supernatural beings was lamented in the Sumerian hymns and incantations. Rituals evolved to bring them back, at least temporarily, using sacrifices and sacred messages. The sacrifices recall the blood that was used to manufacture human beings, acknowledging that our blood is not really ours but theirs. The sacred marriages recall the sons of God mating with the daughters of men. Using these two mechanisms, we were reminding the Apkallu of this ancient event in human history, reenacting over and over through thousands of years that initial trauma, or perhaps we have been working through that trauma ourselves, using ritual to try to understand what happened and what our purpose is on this planet. And already just a few more pages to go. This is flying by, at least for me. I love this material. I don't know. There's something about this synthesis of ancient esoteric and comparative mythological stuff and the conversation about the phenomena and aliens. It just tickles my wonder pickle every time. But anyway, okay, let's continue. These stories were well known through the Levant as late as the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. They were inextricable elements of the culture going back thousands of years. There were even New Testament references to these same Bene Elohim and to the 7 sages, the Apkallu, who were punished for having intercourse with human women and producing hybrid offspring. They were not called Apkallu in the New Testament, of course, but are cited in Peter 2 and Jude as, quote, angels who sinned, unquote, and who were imprisoned in Tartarus. In the Septuagint Greek, usually just translated as hell in the English translations, or in, quote, deep gloom. Tartarus, of course, is the underworld abyss of Greek mythology and the place where the Titans, who themselves sinned against the older gods and were overthrown, were imprisoned. I thought the Titans were actually the older gods, and the Olympians that they fought against were actually the new gods, considering that, Zeus was a child of Kronos, who was a Titan, but I could definitely be wrong about that. This idea of a war in the heavens, which led to the creation of the world and of human beings from divine substances, is familiar throughout the West. Roman and Greek mythology abound in examples, and the same theme would find itself represented in the Abrahamic literature as well. Like the stories about a great flood, these, quote, myths, unquote, reflect knowledge of or experience of an actual event or events. The idea that human beings were created as slaves or playthings of the gods also is present everywhere we look, and the high strangeness element that some type of being with supernatural origin mated with human women in the distant past to create hybrid offspring is also very familiar to Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Jews, not to mention Romans and Greeks. The figure of Prometheus, and here we go. If you've been hearing me talk about the Prometheus myth in general and the Castleland on the show as of late, this is your moment. The figure of Prometheus in Greek mythology shares many elements in common with the Near Eastern narratives. He is regarded as a divine being, actually one of the Titans, who brought wisdom, arts, and learning to human beings, and who stood up for humans in opposition to Zeus and was punished for it. Prometheus most famously stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. He was then chained to a rock for eternity, having his litter eaten every day by an eagle, only to have it grow back at night, until he was rescued by Hercules. In his anger, Zeus fashioned Pandora, the first woman, out of clay and sent her to live with men as a punishment. These various motifs are seen by scholars as iterations of the Mesopotamian originals. During our research program for these books, one of us, Tom, had an interview with a high-ranking member of the military establishment, McCasland. After going over some of the material we had collected, he suggested quite strongly that we take a closer look at Greek mythology. This would have seemed like an odd suggestion were it not for the fact that the Sumerian and Babylonian myths were the original forms of the Greek myths, and we were already hard at work on deconstructing those elements to uncover evidence of contact. There could, of course, be another reason for this emphasis on Greece. After all, the Greek alphabet is a necessary tool for mathematicians and scientists. Greek mythology finds itself overrepresented in the naming protocols for planetary bodies, such as the moon of Jupiter, Titan. Hellenistic influence on Israel was profound in the Second Temple period and led to the revolt of the Maccabees in 167 BCE, memorialized by the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, a religious holiday that did not exist previously. The revolt was begun when King Antiochus of Syria ordered an altar to Zeus built in the Temple of Solomon in 168 BCE and outlawed Judaism. He even ordered pigs be sacrificed there, which is about as bad as it gets. At the same time, there was a serious conflict between the traditionalist Jews and the Hellenizing Jews, but in 165 BCE, the temple was retaken and rededicated, which is the meaning of the word Hanukkah. The Hellenistic period also gave us Hermetism, that form of esotericism found upon the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, and its associated documents concerning alchemy, philosophy, cosmology, and the secret sciences. The Emerald Tablet opens with the line, "That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below." As good as any rephrasing of the statement in Genesis that has God in heaven creating human beings on earth in his image and likeness, quote unquote. The connection between the above and below was absolute and concrete in the mind of the ancients. The one a mirror of the other, a reflection of the event that they had memorialized in their literature, art, and sciences. Today, however, that mirror, that window into the other world, has been covered up as humanity sits Shiva for the death of their dreams. That means like sitting in mourning. There are many other possible avenues to pursue in Greek culture, history, and religion, but at heart the most important event revealed by all of these sources, reiterated time and time again so often that we ignore it as background noise, is the contact between humans and something other. There is even a constant reminder that humans were deliberately created by this other to serve a specific purpose, and when we developed our own intentions and our own goals, however misguided they might have seemed to be, eating of the forbidden fruit or building a tower to heaven, this other tried to stop us and even destroy us. To regard this as purely religious or spiritual or even superstitious belief is an ideological choice that has nothing to do with the evidence. The basic elements of the narrative you have read so far use ancient texts to demonstrate that a real event took place at some point in human history, an event that has caused ripples in every aspect of human endeavor. Ancient peoples did not have the vocabulary for what they experienced or remembered. As a matter of fact, if we judge by the vast majority of UFO sightings, abduction reports, and other aspects of the phenomenon, neither do we. I completely agree with this point. You know that I'm always rambling about this on the show. I think our current ontology, our current metaphysics is completely broken, far too feeble and weak to try to explain things like the diversity, the high weirdness of the phenomenon, and many other things, by the way. Many other things that are, I was going to say more mundane, but is something like consciousness really more mundane? It's the thing that's, I guess, in some ways the most mundane because we're in it, but it's also the most mysterious because we don't even know how to explain it, as Levenda and DeLonge were talking about earlier on in this chapter. And finishing up now, only about a page and a half left. That is why we have chosen to graph this discussion in some basic ways, such as describing the phenomenon as representing a liminal space between this world and a putative other world, a world that can be approached through what the Sumerians and Babylonians called the Gate of the Gods. This gate may be actual in some sense we do not yet understand, but which was understood by the ancients, and perhaps by those who had some measure of contact in our times. Or it may be virtual. Most likely it is a virtual gate that acts as a mental or psychological construct that mimes the actions of the actual gate. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. When the impulse to redefine the religious experience that began with polytheism to a more rigid, doctrinaire monotheism began to take shape, the knowledge that was inherited from the Sumerians and Babylonians, knowledge that claimed direct contact with non-human actors, was rejected in favor of the new paradigm. That is an insane sentence. I'm going to try to run that one back. When the impulse to redefine the religious experience that began with polytheism to a more rigid and doctrinaire monotheism began to take shape, the knowledge that was inherited from the Sumerians and Babylonians, knowledge that claimed direct contact with non-human actors, was rejected in favor of the new paradigm. Whew. Monotheism became the lens through which the past was reimagined, as a time when human beings were savage, uneducated, and gullible, and therefore their accomplishments and histories were devalued as the product of ignorance. Forms of ancient knowledge, although by now fragmentary and incomplete, were preserved in the world of superstition and esotericism, the domain of the secret society and the sorcerer. It has only been within the last 100 years or so that much of this data is being recovered and reevaluated, leading academics and scholars to take a fresh look at the origins of Western monotheism, and realize that many polytheistic concepts that derived from this contact survived within the Abrahamic religions in various forms. The great advantage of monotheism over polytheism, however, was its potential as a unifying factor against the gods. In Sumer, as in later Babylonia, each city-state had its own patron deity. The same would hold true throughout the ancient world in Europe as well as the Middle East. This meant that there were political divisions between human societies that could be exploited to keep humans weak and unable to resist. A monotheistic worldview would unite these city-states under the banner of one patron deity, with all of the citizens in those states united as well in a common political and theological system. Perhaps this was more than a purely ideological challenge of the monotheists against the rest of the world. Perhaps it was an act of defiance against the, quote, sons of God, unquote, and probably with reason. As we have mentioned already, but which bears repeating as we go along and the material becomes more and more challenging, what we are proposing here and in the chapters of the books that follow is a scientific resolution to the old problem of gods, demons, good and evil, religion, magic, and all the impedimenta of the pre-scientific age. What we are proposing is that the ancients were recording an event or events that had a profound effect on human development, on civilization, on technology, erupting into human consciousness and experience today in several different forms. The ancients framed this event in terminology that we read as religious or superstitious today, but these designations did not exist in ancient times. Even the concept of religion is relatively new. In Sumer, religion and science were not separate categories. There was only one approach to knowledge, and it involved the whole mind. The difficulty we face today in understanding or even defining the phenomenon is the result of this fragmentation of knowledge, which has led to the consigning of an entire realm of human experience to an ontological dustbin. Science cannot explain the phenomenon, so scientists refuse to see it. Similarly, there is no space for spirituality in any form within science, so scientists consider it a form of mental illness, a scientific-sounding euphemism that replaces such emotionally loaded terms as superstition and ignorance, but which is just as loaded in other ways. What may be required then is a re-engineering of the way that we look at reality, and of our responsibility toward other human beings in the face of our inability to deal with the phenomenon in any other way. Okay, my friends, much to riff on here. First of all, how are we feeling about this? It's a lot, to put it in the most tepid term possible. First of all, is there truth to this, specifically the overall thesis that Levenda and DeLonge are presenting? Of course, I don't know, and I think anybody who speaks with too much certainty on things like this is probably making a lot of assumptions. But when I look at the ancient world, megalithic structures in particular, the way they are painstakingly built and aligned with the cosmos, their sheer obsession with ritual and initiation and the night sky, I have a hard time believing that that's all just a product of over-imagination and misconceptions about reality. I do suspect that something real was going on, something profound, something that our ancestors took with the utmost seriousness, the kind of serious that really only stems from direct brushes with the mystery. Where I become less sure is when we move from that broad idea to the notion of interacting with actual physical beings. And that isn't to say I rule it out. When you get into this material, particularly some of the material about the Apkallu and literally reproducing with humans, I mean, how can that not be physical? How would you metaphorically copulate and create hybrids with humans? I mean, I guess you could argue that it's a kind of psychic or spiritual copulation. I guess that's possible, but it does sound pretty literal. And then there's the question of cataclysm, of the flood. Clearly, there really were catastrophic floods, a number of them, in fact. And if all the writings of antiquity are any indication, those events seem to have left a huge scar on the collective psyche of humanity. But of course, one could argue that those were just natural phenomena. But is it possible that some of these stories are preserving real memories of threshold shredding moments in human history? Obviously, we can't rule it out. That said, I am very partial to an idea that is somewhat explored in this chapter, and that's the idea that at some point in human history, we seem to have access to some sort of sacred visionary technology, an initiatory art that literally allowed our consciousness to enter a higher reality, to commune with higher intelligences. Levenda himself is actually very interested in this topic, particularly through the lens of what he calls astral ascent or cosmic ascent practices. In fact, the very next chapter of this book is about these cosmic ascent practices. That whole part of the hypothesis and that whole line of inquiry in general rings very true to me and very important to me as someone who has experienced really profound altered states of consciousness. And again, I fully admit that these two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. The esoteric visionary one and the literal physical one could well coexist. And the physical aspect, again, brings me back to the dark possibility that we've been exploring all throughout this video, the notion that we were literally created to be a servant species, some kind of insane alchemical experiment between something terrestrial and the literal blood of a fallen god. It's a crazy and chilling idea, one that I would very much like not to be true. But even if it is true, there is somewhat of a silver lining. First of all, none of this means humanity is doomed or powerless. Yes, at least according to this story, we were born out of conflict and pretty dark-sounding origins. But implicit in it is the idea that we do carry the sacred, the divine, within us to some degree. We're not pure divinity, that's pretty obvious. But we're not inert, powerless matter with no free will either. We're something in between. We're some kind of threshold being. And I think that matters more than the chaos we were born out of. And this would certainly be the more Platonic angle. That if we do have divinity within us, that means we do have some ability to follow and work toward higher truth. And to make it sound even more kind of Platonic and hermetic, that would mean that we're not at all defined by our earthly animal half, that we have the ability to ascend, to reorient ourselves toward a higher metaphysical good. So to put it simply, if these stories do preserve something true about the really dark origins of humanity, they're really not the final word. And I think that's the real revelation here, is that we're unfinished. We're open-ended. We're born into ambiguity and mixture and maybe even bondage of a certain kind. But we also, if we want to work for it, have the capacity to awaken, to reach for something higher, to remember the truth about where we came from on a spiritual level. And honestly, that feels pretty accurate to me. Thank you so much for joining me in this Wonder Dip, my friends. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments, tickle the algorithm, like, sub, comment, share, hype the thing on YouTube, review, do whatever you can on whatever platform you consumed this on. And if you want additional weekly, at least roughly weekly, content, join up over on the YouTube members channel or at patreon.com/thirdeyedrops. Like I said, weekly exclusive content and more if you initiate yourself over on Patreon. Honestly, I'm really stoked on the library of content that we're building over on those platforms, and obviously it does support these transmissions, so I hope to see you there. And with that, my friends, big love. Let me know, like I said, what you think about all of this insanity in the comments, and I'll see you in the next transmission.